welcome to the fifth and final episode of the mini-series, The Reception of the Zohar History here on Zohar Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. Episode 5 finishes with the 20th century, beginning at the beginning of the 20th century with Rav Kook and Rav Yechi Kapach, and continuing on to modern approaches. JJ and myself are interested in recording a reaction episode, so if anyone has any feedback or comments on this episode or the series in general, you can please email those or zoharchat@gmail.com or WhatsApp. This episode of the series is anonymously sponsored by a friend of the podcast in honor of the podcast. To sponsor an episode of the podcast, please email me zoharchat@gmail.com or check out the links and information in the show's notes below. You can also find the link in the show's notes to subscribe to the Zohar Chatter WhatsApp community where I post new Sfarim, new books, book deals, and so on. Please subscribe to the podcast and rate and review, whether you listen on Apple, 24/6, Spotify, or wherever it is that you listen. And finally, I hope you enjoyed and found this series enlightening and informative. And please let me know your thoughts in general on this format and 5 episodes or less with one guest. And also if you have any suggestions for future series, a topic and or a guest, you can let me know as well. Again, emails, farmchatter@gmail.com, or you can message me via WhatsApp if you're on the chat. And with that, enjoy the final episode of the series. Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of the Zohar Chatter podcast, and welcome back to the 5th and final episode of the mini-series here on the podcast, The Reception of the Zohar History with JJ Kimche. This episode, the 5th episode, we're, I guess, in the 20th century, end of the 19th century, 20th century. We're going to start off with Rabbi Kafich, or Rabbi Kapach, and Rav Kook, and we're going to move forward throughout till up to modern times and wrap up with some modern current things. So, JJ, welcome back. Thank you for joining me once again.
Thank you, Nachi. I can't believe it's our 5th episode. We're still doing this, and we're still friends. So that's lovely. And I congratulate any listener who has followed us to this extent. I couldn't have imagined it. And if you're still here, thank you and well done. So yes, as you mentioned, we are going to be going into the 20th century today, and there's a lot to cover. And it's a very interesting century. And the first thing we are going to look at is an exchange between two very important giants, I would say, of their own respective Torah cultures, Rav Yechi Kapach or Kafich and Rav Kook. And we're going to start with the former, who was a fascinating individual. So how his name is spelt by those those from his native Yemen, those Arabic speakers or Judeo-Arabic speakers, something like Kafich or something like that. In Hebrew, he was Hebraized to Kapach, and that has how him and his more famous grandchild, Rav Kapach, who published a lot of manuscripts of the Rambam and other translations of Jewish philosophical texts. So this is the grandfather. This is Rav Yechi Kapach, as I will call him, and he was a rabbinic authority in Sana'a in Yemen in the early 20th century, really up until his death in 1931. So the first few decades of the 20th century, he was one of the major perhaps, rabbinic figure in Yemen, even though he was very much challenged, as we'll see, by others in his hometown, and was never short of controversy, but a very interesting man nonetheless. So yes, he was a local dayan. He was very briefly in the year 1914 a chief rabbi. Much earlier. In the year 1900, roughly, very briefly, he was chief rabbi for a year, and then for quite a while, he was the head of one of the big local yeshivot. And it was in this yeshiva that he began a something of an intellectual revolution within Yemen, in Sana'a, basically what might be called as back to the sources or back to the rationalist sources, right? In other words, he looked around his contemporary society in Yemen among the Jews, and he basically saw that in his mind it was rife with superstition, where he believed to be kind of superstitious practices, superstitious beliefs, all sorts of things like mazalot and kameot and all sorts of rituals to drive away demons and welcome positive spiritual forces, etc., and a very large amount of study of Kabbalah, a very large amount of study of far more mystical texts. And basically, as he saw it, the mainstream rabbinic tradition, which in his eyes ran from the Talmud Bavli through to the Gaonim, specifically Saadia Gaon, and then to the Rambam, and then to the other major sort of Jewish philosophers of the medieval period, that had been essentially abandoned. And he decided to effect, first, a curricular change within the schools under his purview, going back to what he thought as the sources. In other words, the major Jewish philosophical texts, the Emunot V'Dayot, the Moreh Nevuchim, the Kuzari, the Chovot HaLevavot, and basically, again, tracing that line that he saw, the line which begins in Chazal and goes through the major Jewish philosophers of the medieval period, which emphasize Yichud Hashem, which emphasize a sort of pure theological belief that was untainted in his eyes or uncomplicated by all these various later additions and accretions, which he saw as just base superstition. And he sought to, firstly, completely upend the curriculum, but also upend many popular local customs. This is especially interesting in Yemen because, of course, it must be remembered that for quite a while in Yemen, centuries earlier, the Rambam was considered the Murad Asra, as it were. Famously had an epistle to Yemen, and he get it, and for a while, the Yemenite Jews saw the Rambam, many still do today, as their major rabbinic figure. But by the time the Yichya Kapach came to his rabbinic height, he saw that the situation had deteriorated to a tremendous degree, and therefore sought to overturn it. This movement that he, I wouldn't say founded, but certainly was the main figure, was known as the Dor De'ah movement, the Dor De'ah being a phrase from Tanakh meaning a generation of knowledge, as it were, and that became corrupted to Dar Da'im, and as they are known still today in Israel, Dar Da'im movement, and essentially they changed their curriculum, they upended customs that had already been in Yemen for centuries, and this was a big controversy. There were many rabbis for, many rabbis against. He, in fact, his enemies sort of tattled on him, as it were, and he ended up in prison for a while in the year 1915 because of this. And so that's sort of his more activist side. In addition to this, of course, he was a major Torah scholar, and you can see this from his writings, really, really, truly extraordinary figure in terms of his command of the sources. And he wrote various anti-Kabbalistic works, especially after he got out of jail in 1915. He became sort of more militant on the topic, and eventually these coalesced together into a book that was called Milchamot Hashem. It was eventually published and printed around the year 1930. And among other things, so it made certainly something of a splash. He sent it over to Yerushalayim to be printed and to be read, etc. The Milchamot Hashem is one of the most trenchant, the most, I would say, caustic and absolutely unapologetic anti-Kabbalistic books in the whole rabbinic tradition. You'll find very, very few like it, and really marshals sources from across every facet of rabbinic source, every Gemara, all the Gemaras, the Midrashim, Rishonim, Achronim, etc., really in service of the conclusion that Kabbalah is not only fake, it's not only fraudulent, but it is in fact damaging, it is in fact heretical, it has theological beliefs that are untenable, nonsensical, and counter to what he saw as the pure belief in the one God that accompanied Chazal and the early Jewish philosophers and Rambam, Rasag, etc., etc. So the main arguments of Milchamot Hashem, and it's available for PDF download, it's been retyped online, available for PDF download. The main arguments are, firstly, what he does is, the main play that he does is simply to take the Kabbalists at their word, right? Because, of course, don't forget, since the Shomer Emunim, HaKadmon, and various other figures had managed to successfully, I would say, recalibrate early Kabbalistic texts and say, no, when they talk about God in heavily personified anthropomorphic terms and describe his limbs and describe his emotional states, etc., they are really talking metaphorically. They are not describing anything physical, anything, they're certainly not proposing that God has different, literal different elements to him, or a multifaceted God. They're certainly not proposing this. Whereas Rav Yichya Kapach simply says, no, read the Kabbalistic works and take them at their words. When they describe God's limbs, they mean God's limbs. When they describe measurements, they mean measurements. When they describe, the sphere of the 10 parts of God, they mean the 10 parts of God. He very much believed that, no, the early Kabbalists really said what they meant and meant what they said, and it was only later Kabbalists that tried to reinterpret them out of existence. But no, we should read what they really thought and what they really said, and if they really believed in an understanding of God that had, let's say, different parts to it, or certain physical elements to it, etc., in his eyes, that contravened the pure theological view of a perfect, unified, incorporeal God that characterized the Jewish belief since time immemorial. And he thought very clear. The Zohar is very clear. The prayers, the davening goes to different sfirot and different partsufim and different elements of God. And he really believed that this is core to the Kabbalistic tradition, and that's why it has to be. That's why it has to be rejected. He also had an interesting theory about the Zohar, because for those who believe the Zohar really is an ancient manuscript, ancient text, and survived from the time of Rishon Bar Yochai and came to Moshe de Leon in the 13th century, there are various different theories as to how this happened. Some say the Ramban, found in Eretz Yisrael and sent it back to Spain. Others say it was hidden in a cave, and various things. One of the theories was, and that has been reported by Kabbalists, is that in fact it somehow ended up in the court of the Castilian king, who wanted it translated, and eventually got into the hands of Moshe de Leon through the court of the Kabbalistic king. What's interesting about Rav Yichya Kapach is that he takes that story, but but basically says, you see, this shows the foreign, non-Jewish origin of the Sefer Zohar. In other words, he believes that the Zohar is not only, not from Shir Chai. Not only is it late, it's actually not Jewish. It's not Jewish. It doesn't come from a Torah sources at all. It was something created by non-Jews that ended up in the court of the Castilian king, who was at that time, translating and publishing or bringing to light various ancient texts, and it somehow ended up being translated into rabbinic parlance, as it were. But he sees all the ideas in there as absolutely foreign, absolutely not only different from, but completely incompatible with mainstream Jewish theology and Jewish beliefs, and goes on and on in this vein quite significantly. Another point, straight, and of course, as with many of these later books, he brings in many of the points mentioned earlier of Yaakov Emden, etc., and I don't need to rehash all that now. One thing that Rav Yechia Kapach mentions quite a lot and attacks the Zohar and attacks Kabbalah for, very interestingly, is the heavily sexualized imagery that is written in these texts. Now, I don't particularly want to scandalize your audience, and I don't feel the need to go on very graphic terms, but it is important to note that many Kabbalistic texts, including the Zohar, have very graphic images of God and the sort of sexual or sexualized relationship between the different sefirot, specifically between the male Yesod and the female Malchut, and describe sometimes the bodily members and the various expectorations of various kinds, and in quite graphic detail. And Kapach saying, well, what is this? This is a disgrace. This is something that is unthinkable. And he says that, yes, it's true that in books like Shir HaShirim or sometimes in Chazal, you can find some hint to, let's say, a sexual element or a sexual metaphor, let's say, there. But he says they are very delicate and they're much more, just delicately hinted at, and they're certainly not graphic and certainly not explicit, and don't describe sexual acts. He says this is a clear sign that this is something foreign. This is something that is not Jewish. That's not part of the Jewish tradition, because it describes elements of the divine, certainly in terms, in not only in physical terms, but in gross, base physical terms that are just unacceptable, really, within the Jewish tradition. And that's another point, a very important point he makes. And another thing a point he makes, which I didn't really see anywhere else, which I thought was quite interesting, is that he says that there is a duty, and he quotes various Ma'amari Chazal, etc. Basically, according to him, there is a duty to very thoroughly investigate any idea that is new. He's suspicious of innovation. He actually, in a funny way, a very, very small c conservative type of religious figure, where basically says that the problem with the Zohar, the problem with the Kabbalah, is that it's an innovation, is that it's something very new. It's something that didn't accompany the Jewish people throughout the centuries, it wasn't there at the early, at the founding, so to speak, of Jewish theology through the writings of Chazal and the writings of the Gaonim and the early Rishonim, etc. And therefore, he says, why should we give it credence? On the contrary, Chazal, ordered us, essentially, to be suspicious of new ideologies and to investigate them very thoroughly to make sure that they, in fact, are compatible with age-old Jewish beliefs. And according to Kabbalah fails on all of these accounts, and that's his main point. Now, I would say, the Milchamat Hashem is a very powerful book and worth reading, and it's a book one should admire to a certain degree because it's very, very source based. Shadal has quite a lot of sources, and others have a lot of sources, but this is very, constantly quoting Chazal and from Rishonim, etc. The issue a little bit is that, of course, from Kapach's point of view, Chazal certainly couldn't have been talking in anthropomorphic terms, even though some of their statements do seem to go in that way. So basically, he's of the opinion that the Kabbalistic text should be taken fully, literally, and I would say from his perspective, uncharitably, as describing physical elements of God. Whereas when it comes to Ma'amari Chazal, he's obviously much more careful, much more delicate. He believes that they obviously couldn't, the Rambam's vein of thought couldn't possibly be referring to literally and incorporate God, and therefore, we have to make allowances for that. But nonetheless, it is a powerful book, and worth reading on that score.
Okay, and as you said, there is a new new typeset available. You can get it, you can find it online. That being said, on the flip side, the one, because it's interesting, in the 20th century, there's not so much of this. I think this is, we'll get to more of that. But the flip side of this is Rav Kook, who doesn't write a systematic book on him, and there's something in your letters on Kabbalah. You have there a translated letter of Rabbi Kapach to Rav Kook, and Rav Kook defends Kabbalah.
Yes. So we're going to get to that. So as I said, the book was translated the book was published and circulated around the year 1930, shortly before the death of Rav Kapach. And one of those who got hold of some of his writings was Rav Kook from in Eretz Yisrael, who was then, at the very peak of his powers in the chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine at the time. And of course, Rav Kook. I don't need to tell the august audience of this podcast about Rav Kook and the Kabbalistic basis of his ideology. And you just had a thorough few-part series by Yehuda Mirsky, who's a well-renowned expert, and therefore go to him with all your questions on the subject. But of course, Rav Kook took the, I would say, mainstream rabbinic line that's sympathetic to Kabbalah and certainly believes the Zohar to be authentic and of the antiquity that it claims. And therefore, Rav Kook writes him a letter. There's an exchange of two letters between Rav Kook and Rav Kapach in the year 1931. Now, these letters are dear to me because they appear in the book that I edited and published with Da'at Press called Letters on Kabbalah. So the first half of the book is, after my introduction, the first half of the book is the letters between Shadal and Ben Amozeg. And the second half of the book is letters translated into English by Ben Rothstein on this exchange of letters between Rav Kook and Rav Kapach. So anyone who wants to read it can read it there. So you have this exchange of letters, and Rav Kook writes to Rav Kapach. Now, I'm going to say something which is perhaps not so kind to Rav Kook, but it is. That is the sense that I got from reading these letters. And Rav Kook, of course, one has enormous admiration for him, naturally. But nonetheless, in this letter that he writes to Rav Kapach, he does come off as a tad patronizing, as a little bit of someone who's at the very center. He's the chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, sitting in Yerushalayim, in his yeshiva. And of course, Rav Kook, a product of the very best European yeshivas, Volozhin and elsewhere. And someone who's corresponding with and part of the generation of great Talmidei Chacham in Eretz Yisrael and Europe in general. And he's writing to Rav Kapach, who from his perspective is out in Yemen. Now, Yemen, of course, being the very, very periphery of the Jewish world. And therefore, he writes to Rav Kapach in such a manner to say, of course, it's very rabbinic exchange of letters. There's a lot of melitza, there's a lot of sort of throat clearing and rabbinic compliments, to the great, esteemed, etc., etc. Harav Hadome Lamalach Hashem Tzvakah, and the basically writes to him a letter in which he says, no, surely there's been a big misunderstanding, surely there's been a mix-up, if only you knew this and this source, don't you know about this, and don't you know about that, and gave him a few sources which Rav Kook seemed to think that Rav Kapach didn't know, and basically saying, surely there's a big misunderstanding, and once you know this, you'll accept the Kabbalah as the great foundation of Jewish ideas, and then holy and ancient, etc., and you'll be brought back into the fold. This seems to be Rav Kook's overall idea. A few arguments he makes in this letter that are worth mentioning. One is that he basically makes the point. It's not an unfair point at all, actually, which is that look, Kabbalah or Kabbalistic authors like Chazal run a risk, and the risk is that by describing God in anthropomorphic terms, some people might get the wrong end of the stick, and some people might think they actually mean it literally, that God does have limbs and that God does have dimensions, etc., etc. But Rav Kook says so to Chazal. Chazal do the same thing, and guess what? It's a risk. It's risky because some people might misinterpret it, but nonetheless they saw it as worth it. And so too the Kabbalists. They also believe this to be a worthwhile risk, and therefore you can't say that it's illegitimate to say they really, really meant it. No, they were speaking in anthropomorphic terms. Dibra Torah Kilshon Bnei Adam. However, they certainly didn't mean it that way, and just like Chazal didn't mean it that way, so too the Kabbalists didn't mean it that way, and therefore, but nonetheless, they thought it was worth the sort of theological risk involved writing in this manner. He admits that some Kabbalistic works or some works that pose as Kabbalah are not true Kabbalistic works. He points out certain Sabbatean works that Rav Kapach seems to have in his possession and other such things. He also seems to be a little bit humble in terms of theology, Rav Kook, in saying that, obviously, any work, Kabbalistic or not Kabbalistic, is describing God as best as we understand it, rather than in a purely truthful way, right? In other words, mitzideinu v'lo mitzido, right? It's a way of talking about God in which we, through our own minds and our own categories, try and encapsulate it the best we can, but basically not laying claim to sort of objective truths about God as put out in the as some seem to believe it to be. These are a few of the arguments in that letter. It's not a very long letter. It's worthwhile reading. However, what's funny is that Rav Kapach did not take this lying down. Rav Kapach penned a rejoinder, a very, very strong and I would say almost harshly worded rejoinder, even though, again, he joins in Rav Kook with all these conventions of rabbinic letters and, lagon, ha'adir, etc., etc. I'm sort of paraphrasing, but you get the point. It's a very rabbinic exchange of letters, very suffused from beginning to end with sources and rabbinic expressions, etc. That's why I recommend reading in translation for those for whom that's difficult. But essentially, he just defends his points and reiterates many of the points I mentioned above that he published in Milchamot Hashem, and basically absolutely refusing to budge, absolutely refusing to yield, and telling Rav Kook, don't imagine that you are sitting there in the center of the Jewish world, and this is the subtext, but don't imagine you're sitting there in the center of the Jewish world and can dictate to me, this poor provincial, what to do, but rather he gave it to him with both barrels. These are the sources, and these are the sources, and the Kabbalists are, saying this heretically and saying this disgracefully, etc., etc., and really a lengthy and detailed list of arguments why Rav Kook's sources are wrong, and that's it. That is the sort of that's the extent of the exchange of letters. We don't have any further exchange of letters between them. Rav Kapach died shortly afterwards in 1931, and Rav Kook died shortly afterwards in 1935, and then that was the end of the exchange of letters. But it is a very interesting exchange, just to see two very impressive Torah giants, I would say, on different sides of the world, very much on the opposite side of this opinion. One last thing I would say about this exchange of letters, which I thought was very interesting, is one point on which they argue is a point which we described in, I think, the very first episode that we did together here in this series. For those who can cast their mind back, I don't know how closely together you're listening to all 5 of these episodes, but it could be months apart. But the very first episode, we talked about the one of the Tshuvot of the Rivash, right? And he there explains how he was, basically his objections to certain Kabbalistic practices, and he says, V'zar ma'od be'inai, and then he says, and I heard from Echad meha mitpal safim, I heard one of the mitpal safim, one of the philosophically minded people in his area, whoever that may be, basically saying that, that the Kabbalists have turned 10 gods into one god into 10, but the Christians turned one god into 3, and the Kabbalists turned one god into 3. You heard that from Echad meha mitpal safim. Now, what's interesting is, in this exchange of letters between Rav Kook and Rav Kapach, is that the two of them have completely opposite opinions as to who these mitpal safim were. According to Rav Kook, this phrase, mitpal safim, is a dismissive phrase. It is, one of the sort of the maskilim, so to speak. Speaking anachronistically, one of the people who are mitpal safim. No, not a Talmud Chacham, not a great rabbi, but a mitpal sef, someone who one of the philosophers has mentioned this, right? And according to Rav Kook, Rivash is saying this dismissively, as though to discredit this particular point. Whereas Rav Kapach thinks precisely the opposite. When he says mitpal safim, he means himself. In other words, he said it's a kind of euphemistic way of describing his own opinion. That this is the case. And in fact, the Rivash wouldn't have quoted it if it wasn't his own opinion. It seems to be quoted approvingly. That by depicting God as having these 10 sefirot, and that these 10 sefirot are actually part of God, and depict correctly the divine realm, as it were, the divine ecology or ecosystem, then you've effectively split God into 10, much like the Christians split God into 3. So anyway, that's an interesting sort of textual minutia that is debated between Rav Kook and Rav Kapach in this exchange of letters.
And you can see that in the, again, letters on Kabbalah, which will be linked in the show's notes. And we'll talk at the end about suggested reading and primary sources and secondary sources, and we'll get to that. So that's really this. And now we're going to turn really to the rest of the 20th century, and there's a lot of the interesting part is that after this, really, it kind of dies down. I don't know if you can. I know, but I'll just say I know Boaz talks about this, but it's interesting, and I'll let you talk to this, JJ, about what about this. It really dies down, especially in rabbinic circles, that there's like a kind of fight back and forth about it. It's really academics have their opinion. We started the series. Academics have their opinions, and the frum world has its opinions, and that's kind of the end of the whole thing,
right? More
or less.
Yes. I would say that certainly there was a time period, the 19th century, a little bit of the early 20th century, where a range of people could talk to each other and did talk to each other. They wrote each other's letters. They responded to each other's articles in great journals of various kinds, Torah journals, Maskilic journals, etc., etc. in the mid to late 20th century, this has very much died down as communities have siloed off, and certainly intellectual communities have siloed off. There's the yeshiva world, and there's the academic world, and there's this world, and there's that world, and there's actually precious little dialogue between them for a large part of the last century. What I will say is, funnily enough, that in the last 10, 15 years, I think this has actually reversed itself because of the internet, because of the blogosphere, because of, people having access to the same platforms of communication. There is, again, a revival of debate, again, not between the giants of each world, but, you certainly have more Haredi-leaning people and more modern-leaning people, let's say, yeshiva world versus, say, the more modern world, who are debating things back and forth. And, many of you are aware of many of these platforms or blogs, or, you can find these discussions on Facebook and various other places. But anyway, that's aside. So what I'm going to do now a little bit. So, okay, the first thing I want to talk about is developments a little bit in academia. And for there, we have to go to the greatest Kabbalah scholar in the history of academia, and that is, of course, our good friend Gershom Scholem. So Scholem was born right at the end of the 19th century in Germany, grew up in Germany. He was from a typically bourgeois, kind of disconnected family. He very early on fell in love with Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, even though that was, at the time, considered absolutely ridiculous and outrageous, and eventually made his way to Israel in the 1920s, took up professorship in the Hebrew University, and from the 1920s to the 1980s, to his death in 1982, he sat in the Hebrew University and did his job. Now, Gershom Scholem is one of the most important scholars ever to study the Kabbalah, obviously in full stop, and I want to explain why he was so important and his sort of the nature of his genius and his giant stature in the world of Kabbalah, or Kabbalah studies, certainly anyone who studied Kabbalah after him. So a few things. Firstly is his scholarship, right? He had an extraordinary brain, and not only that, he wrote a absolutely prolific amount, okay? And he was instrumental in bringing Kabbalistic texts out of obscurity into the mainstream, or certainly into ways, into platforms in which other scholars could use them. So he would go, certainly pre-war, go around libraries all over Europe, all over the place, find the most obscure texts, and he would reference them or translate them or transcribe them and bring them out. And really, he did more than anyone else, simply to bring the texts that have been languishing in manuscripts in forgotten libraries all around the world to the attention of the world of scholarship. He simply expanded what we had, the primary materials we had in Kabbalah. And he was an extraordinary scholar in a minute way, right? This is something that is, I think, at the heart of Gershom Scholem's genius and his lasting influence in the Jewish world, which is that he was both a brilliant scholar of the minutiae, of the tiniest elements, and also a great grand theorist of mysticism and of religion writ large. And it's very rare to find the two. In fact, it's very difficult to find the two. In most areas of scholarship, you'll find people who do the tiny textual elements, compare this manuscript with that manuscript, there's a vav here, this word is missing, this paragraph is missing, tiny textual elements on the one hand. And you'll find on the other hand, those who are philosophers, who look at the whole scope of history of ideas on a topic and come up with these grand theories of the development of ideas. And Gershom Scholem did both, and did both brilliantly and with a tremendous amount of his own personal authority. So, for example, many of his books, his massive book on Shabtai Tzvi, his famous book published in the 1940s called Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism, which really is the foundational book of Kabbalah scholarship in the 20th century, no doubt about it. And basically he was, in those books, he created narratives, historical theories, even I would say mythologies of what Jewish mysticism is. Have this whole notion of what David Bial later called counter-history, this notion that there's this sort of visible current of Jewish ideas on the top, and then bubbling, gurgling underneath is this counter-history of a more mythical and antinomian kind of Judaism, which burst itself to the surface occasionally, as it did in Lurianic Kabbalah, as it did in Sabbatean Kabbalah, as it did in Hasidism, etc., and all sorts of theories and lines of continuity between them. And basically, Gershom Scholem, that was, in a way, a secret of his genius for success. And he was, not only that, he was also a serious scholar of religion writ large who was respected and was in contact with many of the other great scholars of religion at the time, be it Carl Jung or Mircea Eliade or various others who he met and when he used to go to his conferences in Europe. And so therefore he was that sort of scholar. And finally, I would say, just in terms of the Hak, as they say, of the raid. Gershom Shalom also, for many decades, was the most powerful, or one of the most powerful professors in the Hebrew University. Right? He said what went and what didn't go. He decided who got positions and who didn't get positions. Right? And by doing that, he not only founded the field of Kabbalah, but nurtured it and taught many of the major students and made sure that the right people, quote unquote, right people in his eyes, got the right places. And so, for example, Martin Buber, who made Aliyah at a certain point, couldn't get a position in Machshevet Yisrael at the Hebrew University or any of the major departments of Jewish thought because Shalom didn't like him. And Shalom simply blocked the appointment. And Buber, one of the great Jewish thinkers in many people's eyes of the 20th century, ended up, I think, in the Department of Education because that's the only place that they were willing to give him a tekken because Gershom Shalom opposed it. Again, he was a very powerful, he had a large amount of political power. Anyway, this is all by the by, but Gershom Shalom's works function to this day as the foundation of Kabbalah studies, with the caveat that since Shalom, every single scholar has tried to a certain degree, debate him, undermine him, refute him, argue with him, complicate, problematize all of his Shalom's work, and that really has been much of the endeavor in Kabbalistic studies, over the last 70, 80 years or so. But again, you can't ignore Shalom. It's like trying to write a history of Jewish philosophy without referencing the Rambam. You can't do it. There's too many people are either influenced by or argue against. Shalom is the foundation stone. Anyway, so now with regard to his theories on the Zohar, he actually has a very interesting pathway on this. Okay, because he begins, in fact, very early on in his Jewish in his sort of road towards Jewish scholarship was shortly after his bar mitzvah. He started reading Heinrich Gretz's History of the Jews, and he loved it. That's when he fell in love with Judaism, Jewish ideas, Jewish scholarship, etc. And at that point, and of course, Heinrich Gretz was very anti-Kabbalah, super skeptical of all Kabbalistic texts, but certainly the Zohar, and saw it as not only the work of Moshe de Leon, but also the work of a swindler, a forger, as I said in the previous episode. Now, at a certain point in his early 20s, Gershom Shalom actually rebels against Heinrich Gretz on many levels, and believes, and spends much of his life trying to undo and paper over, really, the works of the Wissenschaftliches Judentum movement, and specifically Heinrich Gretz. And I actually write about this in an article called Conflicted Disciples. You should put it in the show notes, showing how Shalom and Dubnov and others break away from Gretz in various ways. And one of the ways he breaks away from Gretz is in the 1920s, he begins to he begins to investigate this, and his position at the beginning was that no, the Zohar is in fact the work of Rosh Bar Yochai. And in his inaugural address in the Hebrew University was this, showing the Zohar, the Gretz thinks it's 13th century, it's De Leon. Actually, no, it's ancient, it's Rosh Bar Yochai. However, then he starts investigating it, slowly. And he comes, basically, after about 15 years of research, he comes to the precise opposite conclusion. He, after painstaking research of the manuscripts and the philology and reading every text that was about it, he comes eventually to the inevitable conclusion, in his eyes at least, that the Zohar is in fact a late document, that in fact it was written by Moshe de Leon. And in his book, Major Trends, he has two important chapters on the Zohar, one about the book and its author. And there he basically says that, he's rather ruefully, rather sadly, he says, I have no choice but to endorse Gretz's conclusion, which he used to repudiate, but I have no choice but to endorse it because it seems to him that it's very obvious that Moshe de Leon did, in fact, write the book. Now, Gershom Shalom's chapter there in Major Trends, a very important chapter, is worth reading. He dates the Zoharic text quite precisely in his eyes. He really thinks that he can trace it because of its linguistic sort of background very, very closely to, let's say, to about the years 1280 to 1296, something like that. That's where he really believes that he can pinpoint actually quite well in terms of the years when the texts were in fact written for a variety of reasons. And I mean, he quotes various of the arguments that we made above, but really at heart, Gershom Shalom was a philologist, right? And he brought to bear his skills of linguistics, of language analysis of the Zohar to date it quite precisely. And he notes how, in many ways, it's a later Aramaic, it's a corrupt Aramaic, it's a much later than Talmudic Aramaic for various reasons. One argument that he makes, which I find fascinating, which I think ought to be known, and I think for me this is quite a powerful argument, is that he says that it's an Aramaic that's obviously written with a background of philosophical Hebrew, of people who've read the Hebrew philosophical works of the medieval period, especially, this is the major point, those books that were translated by the Tibbonite family, right? So there was a family of translators, Yehuda, Ibn Tibbon, Shmuel, Ibn Tibbon, etc. And they were the ones responsible for translating most of the major Jewish philosophical works from Arabic or Judeo-Arabic into Hebrew. So they translated the Moreh Nevuchim, they translated Ibn Zudeo, they translated Chovat HaLevavot, translated etc., etc. All the books that for centuries and centuries rabbinic figures read in Hebrew, they were in fact the translations of the Tibbonite family. Now, according to Shalom, the Tibbonite family translated it in a very specific Arabic way, right? And they used essentially the Arabisms that made their way into Hebrew. And according to Shalom, the Zohar bears linguistic clues or hints or characteristics of the kind of Hebrew that was formed by Arabic. In other words, Judeo-Arabic that became translated into the Hebrew by the Tibbonite family. One of the phrases he quotes is "im kol da," which means sort of nevertheless or despite this. And it's made its way to Hebrew, and therefore he says, look, it's very clear these texts were composed after the Tibbonite family translated all these great Jewish texts into Hebrew, and then those Hebrew words got lifted into Arabic. And the truth is that this is the sort of thing a philologist can do. I'll give you just sort of an example that sometimes you can see when someone writes in one language that they are in fact heavily influenced by another language in which they write or think. So the most obvious example, I think, that sort of jumps out to me is the very first sentence of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Right, the very first sentence of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah is Yesod HaYesodot va'amot HaChachmot leida sheyesh sham matzui rishon. Right, the very foundation is to know sheyesh sham matzui rishon, that there is a first cause. Now, what is strange about that is that the phrase sheyesh sham is not a Hebraic phrase. Right, in Hebrew you don't say yesh sham, you say yesh. Yesh mashu, yesh matzur yeshon, yesh shulchan, yesh kiseh, right? You don't say yesh sham. You do say that in other languages. For example, in English, we actually say that. We say there is, right? Yesh sham. We actually use that phraseology, even though it's in Hebrew. And that's how you say it in Arabic as well. The phrase in Arabic to describe something as being there, as existing, is you say there is. And Rambam, who philosophically thought in Arabic, but in the Mishnah Torah wrote in Hebrew, when he was writing the philosophical elements, he sort of transposed his Arabic into the Hebrew and wrote Yesh Sham Matzui Rishon, right? So in other words, this is just an example, sort of a favorite example of mine, but a way in which you can tell when a thinker is essentially thinking in one language but writing in another, and therefore will transpose some of the verbal tics or sort of linguistic conventions, as it were, from one language into the other, and you can see that has a discernible imprint in the final text, right? And so Shalom basically, according to his analysis, could find in various places in the Zohar evidence of this kind of very late Hebraisms that were concocted by the Tibbonite family of translators that made its way into Hebrew and eventually into the Zoharic Aramaic. So that's an important element of Shalom. What I would say, in fact, I actually want to say the final thing on Shalom's journey, because I find it personally fascinating, which is that he wrote an autobiography, Gershom Shalom, called From Berlin to Jerusalem, originally in German, and then he wrote a Hebrew version that's augmented. And basically the very final paragraph, the very last words of the biography describes when he arrives in Israel and takes up his position in the Hebrew University, right? So it's just a biography of his early life and his position in Hebrew University. And basically, this is his moment of making it, of getting there. He's got off the boat, he's in Israel, he's landed, he's a very fervent Zionist, landed in Israel, has taken the Hebrew University, begins his tenureship there, and starts off with this lecture, as I mentioned before, trying to show the Zohar is ancient, but then slowly starts to, in his eyes, realize what he believed to be the truth, right? And I'm going to read you that final paragraph. So I find it very interesting that he ends his autobiography on this point. Okay, I'll read it in the Hebrew version, which is the one I have. The augmented version, it goes as follows. So he's arrived at the Hebrew University, 1925, and he says, "Yashavti v'katavti hartza'at pticha al noseh meratek. Ha'im chiber Rav Moshe Leon et Sefer HaZohar. V'sikamti o chidashti sham et kol ha'ta'anot hamdabrot neged hanacha zu v'hadorshot b'dika chadasha v'shitatit shel motza ha'sefer v'hitpatchut ha'kabbalah kula b'lo mishpatim kedumim. לחקירה כזאת הקדשתי את 10 עד 15 השנים הבאות, וסיתרתי אחת לאחת את כל טענותיי שבהרצאת הפתיחה, אף על פי שיצאתי להוכיח אמיתותן. ומתוך תהפוכות אלה נתקיים בי הפסוק, אמת מארץ תצמח. right? So it's quite a moving passage on which to end the autobiography. He basically says that, I arrived in Israel, gave this lecture, but actually over the next 10 or 15 years, I experienced this kind of intellectual maturation, as it were, and slowly but surely refuted every single one of the claims that I made in that initial lecture, and that eventually became my dedicated position. So that was the position of Shalom, and he firmly believed that Moshe de Leon wrote the entire thing, apart from maybe a little bit the Tikkunim and the Zohar Chadash and the other sort of 14th century texts. But yes, that was Shalom's, and that became the view in academia for a while, and I'll get to a little bit at the end, sort of more contemporary academic trends.
Okay, but it's important to point out, as you did, he did flip his position from his original position to later. So that's
right,
worth knowing.
Of course, that's the important thing. Because in other words, people say, Shalom believed Moshe de Leon wrote the Kabbalah, but it was the end of a very long process where he did flip his position. Initially, he believed otherwise, and then eventually he came around to that conclusion. But it's interesting, and that became I'd say the accepted position for most things. And of course, something I should mention about Shalom's books as well, that Shalom was the first writer whose books really perforated into mainstream academia. So you could find great figures in the late 20th century, even quite considerable writers such as Harold Bloom, or the philologist and novelist Umberto Eco, or George Steiner, or many other sort of quite serious late 20th century academic figures who loved Shalom, who read Shalom's works, who quoted them, and who sort of integrated Kabbalah and certainly linguistic theories within Kabbalah into their own works. It's very interesting. That's actually one of the most interesting elements of the late 20th, early 21st century when it comes to discussing Kabbalah, which is that Kabbalah became cool again. It became something fascinating that, religious theorists and scholars of mysticism and historians and, linguists of novelists of various kinds, they all start integrating Kabbalistic ideas into their works. And a very large portion of that is down to the works of Gershom Shalom, who for the first time put eventually in English, the not only Kabbalah in a sort of intellectually thorough manner, but also in a way that had this whole mythology and these grand religious theories about them, and therefore, allowed for its eventual both through osmosis and through people actually studying it, it's entering into the mainstream. Before moving on from Shalom, very briefly, I mentioned one of Shalom's colleagues and students was Yeshaya Tishby, an important figure in the story, because Yeshaya Tishby wrote the first book that is very, I would say, probably the best introduction to the Zohar. It's called Mishnat HaZohar. It's 2 volumes. It was published in Hebrew, and eventually it got translated into English, published by Lippmann Library as The Wisdom of the Zohar. What it does is, firstly, it has a huge introduction, all about the history of the Zohar and Kabbalah and Zohar criticism, and who it was written by and why, and it's really a fantastic introduction, like a 120-page introduction. But also, what it does is it takes large portions of the Zohar, translates them into Hebrew, into very readable and palatable Hebrew, and organizes it by topic, right? So you have, topic on theology, and a topic on mankind, a topic on messianism, and a topic on the problem of evil, etc. And I think if for someone who wants to approach the Zohar, never has before, I would recommend going through Yeshaya Tishby's works first, simply because it's a very good and not just good, it's thorough and sympathetic, but also academically rigorous and well footnoted and explained entry into the Zoharic cosmos, as it were. And therefore, I'd recommend it. Apparently, this is why I heard sort of on the academic grapevine, which is that Shalom was furious when Tishby published this, because Shalom kind of felt that he had a not monopoly, but he had the right. Lo mishpat habechora. He had the right to publish on the Zohar and publish on Kabbalah mysticism. And Tishby basically said to him, I'm just going to prepare a little likut, a sort of a small anthology of some Zoharic texts, and just publish it with a little introduction. Surely you won't mind. And then what he did was prepare this massive, brilliant, serious academic work. And apparently Shalom was not amused that Tishby had so thoroughly eclipsed him in this particular manner.
Yeah, but the introduction is well worth reading. Again, the Hebrew is 3 volumes available from Mossad Bialik, Mishnat HaZohar, and you would also get it, as you said, in English from Lippmann, and we'll get to that when we discuss secondary material. And the bulk of the work is, selections with introductions and things from the Zohar. The part that's relevant to this series really is that about 100-page introduction.
Yes, it's a massive introduction and well worth a read. Anyhow, Okay, fine. So now what I'm going to do, again, just to sort of tie up some of the loose ends in this series, and there are a few things I want to do. One of them is to talk about some of the rabbinic statements on this question of the Zohar, or do you need to believe in the Zohar? Is not believing in the Zohar heretical? So there are a few rabbinic statements that came out on this topic in the last half century or so. And what I would say is that I must confess I have not done this research myself. I'm relying on what has been collected by Mark Shapiro in his Hebrew essay Im Yesh Chiyuv Lahamin B'Sefer HaZohar, or something like that, published in Milin Chavivin, and he there has collated some of the rabbinic opinions, one way or another, over the last century or so. So one of them is Rav Chaim Kanievsky, who wrote a tshuva on the topic. Rav Chaim Kanievsky comes down very sharply and says, if you do not believe in the authority and antiquity of the Zohar, you are an apikoros. You are a heretic. He was absolutely, unflinching on this point. And I suppose that is an influential position in the yeshiva world. I would say, Agav, that I found a few times you can, in some of these sidurim that you find in Hasidic shuls, right? You can find these Nusach HaRika of sidurim, and at the back, what they've sometimes done is they have the 13 ikarim of the Rambam, but a few of these sidurim, they've added their own ikarim themselves, right? And I remember seeing in a couple of them something like the statement that Ani Ma'amin B'Emunah Shlema, that shekol divrei HaZohar, v'kol divrei HaArizal, v'kol divrei Baal Shem Tov, emes. Right? Now, some sort of formulation like that, and you can find in some of these sidurim where it's clear that this has been, obviously certainly wasn't part of the Rambam's original 13, but this has become in certain circles, certainly certain Hasidic circles, an article of faith that yes, the Zohar to reject the Zohar, to repudiate it, to undermine it, is to undermine the whole mystical tradition, the whole Torah Shabbat Peh, and therefore the whole edifice of Judaism itself, and therefore that is untenable for sort of some of this world. So that's the position of Chaim Kanievsky. A different position was taken by Rav Ovadia Yosef. So he was asked specifically about the Dardaim, because many of the, obviously a vast portion of Jews from Yemen made their way over to Eretz Yisrael at some point, including the Dardaim movement, which still functions, as far as I know, to some degree or another in Eretz Yisrael, even though they are less, shall we say, less vituperative and less trenchant on this point of anti-Kabbalah and anti-Zohar than the founder Riche Kapach. And he, and basically the question becomes, okay, so you have these people who don't seem to accept the Zohar, don't seem to accept Kabbalah. What do we do with them? Like, are they heretics or not? And Rav Ovadia Yosef comes out with a tshuva saying, no, they're not heretics. They are mistaken. They, obviously, he says, Maran Bet Yosef, for Rav Ovadia Yosef, the Bet Yosef, Rav Yosef Kara was, his major intellectual hero and religious hero, and basically based himself as much as possible on Maran, as he called him. So because Maran, gave the rubber stamp to the Zohar, gave the rubber stamp to Kabbalah, so obviously it must be, in his eyes, authentic and true. However, he says that those who deny it are not heretics. They've yet to see the light, as it were. And that's his position. It seems to be, so that's Rav Yosef's position. Mark Shapiro in that essay also transcribes parts of an essay by Rav Yitzchak Isaac Halevi Herzog, who was the first chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael. And he takes the position, I mean, it's a bit longer than this, but I'm going to boil it down. He takes the position that essentially there's a big difference between those who deny Torah Hasod in its entirety, and those who just doubt that certain books or certain elements are a faithful representation of Torah Hasod, right? It's kind of a middle position, as it were, where he basically says that, it basically says that, those who completely deny that there is any kind of mysticism or any kind of esoteric doctrines or teachings which have made their way down, if they deny all of it, if they basically take the Shadal or of Kapach position, then they are heretics. Whereas, those who say not this book or not this text or not this element, then we can't sort of throw them out entirely. So that is that position. In Shapiro's essay, he does also quote a certain figure who he doesn't name, who wrote an essay under the title Rabbi Haredi, but he he apparently, said that he approached certain rabbis, including Rav Aryeh Carmel, who's a Talmud of Rav Dessler, and Rav Gedalia Nadel, and others, asking about this question. And the answer he got from several of them was essentially something close to the Rav Yaakov Emden line, saying that large parts of the Zohar are in fact late, are in fact fraudulent, are in fact not part of the original transmission, original tradition. And that was the position taken apparently by some of these figures. Now, again, these aren't. These are quite, I would say, influential figures in the yeshiva world. Certainly, if what Rav Karmel said about Rav Dessler is true, that's certainly of importance. Also, Rav Gedalia Nadel. So that is something that's also worth noting. So these are some of the rabbinic opinions quoted therein. There may be others, but as I said, that this hasn't been something that I've researched all that much. But nonetheless, it's interesting to note that there is an array of opinions, not only about the Zohar, but also about those who deny the Zohar. And Machlok is there certainly between Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Rav Yosef, and others sort of contemporary posts. One other also final thing I want to do is to talk just for a couple of minutes, because it's a fascinating area of ideas, but I can't really do it justice, but just to let the audience know a little bit about sort of more recent trends in the academic world about Zoharic scholarship. Because, of course, Shalom wrote his position in Major Trends, which was published in the 1940s. But this certainly wasn't the final one, right? So Gershom Shalom's opinion was that basically almost all the Zohar that we have is the result of the fruit of Rav Moshe de Leon, right? So between the years about 1280 to 1296, the Sefer Yuchasim was correct, and that essentially, and that's all there is to it. Of course, there are some later texts and some later points, etc. But that was Shalom's opinion. There are some who still hold to this to a certain extent. For example, Daniel Matt, who's the main translator and editor of the massive Pritzker edition translation of the Zohar. So he said to me that he thinks something like 70% of the Zohar is written by Moshe de Leon, and that's his take on it. And so that was sort of one position that there was. However, there have been more recent positions advanced. So one is by a brilliant scholar called Yehuda Libas, who is currently, I still believe, a professor at Hebrew University in Kabbalah, a brilliant scholar in so many fields and languages, etc. And his theory was essentially, and he again gives all sorts of reasons for believing this to be the case, is that the Zohar is actually something much closer to a collaborative project. It wasn't the fruit of one person, right? It is the result of a circle of mystics in Castile in the 13th century, giving some other names, as we mentioned earlier, Yosef Gikatila, Yosef Angelet, Todros Abulafia, others. And basically his idea is that the Zohar isn't just Moshe de Leon, it's all of these figures. All of these, the Chevraya there are in fact representative of this circle of mystics, and these people would discuss and come up with mystical pirushim on the Torah and have all sorts of compose various tales and compose various ideas, and then eventually these texts were compiled, edited, put into one book. But basically, it undercuts the authorship of one person and brings it and makes it a sort of work of many figures. And the funny thing is that this position, which one of its merits, I think, is funny, is that some of the earlier defenders of the Kabbalistic tradition against the theory that was written by Moshe de Leon, including, I believe, the Ben Yochai and Rav David Luria, they mention this. They say, no, the Zohar is much too large and complicated and sort of multifaceted for it to really be just one random author in the 13th century. And so what the sort of merit of Libas's position is that, no, it wasn't just, you're right, it's not just one author, it's actually several authors, a whole circle of very brilliantly imaginative and sort of fruitful mystics coming together and eventually producing this text that they made its way and eventually morphed into the Sefer HaZohar as we know it. So it's something much more diffuse, not really the imagination of one person, which I suppose makes sense because the Zohar really is a mammoth and brilliant and multifaceted work in so many ways that to say one person wrote this, I can see why there are those who'd be skeptical of it, although it's not impossible. Other sort of trends that there are, there's also another brilliant scholar called Ronit Miroz in Israel in the university or somewhere, and she and her position really is that actually in the Zoharic text you can see several different shichvot, several different strata, as it were, sort of levels. And these levels belong not only to different people, but actually to different time periods. That she believes that we have texts from the 13th century, the 12th century, the 11th century. You have sort of various different levels all intermingled. And what she does, what she proposes to do, is to try and analyze and try and separate these apart, right? So, take a text from the Zohar. So she actually done this. She, I think, published a few years ago, I think, Parsha Shemos, I think, or one of the Parashot of the Zohar, and basically takes it apart and shows, this level belongs, that this sort of group of texts belongs to this century, this area, this thinker, etc., and sort of breaks it down, and she sees it as a much more of a composite text written over a much longer period of time, including a much wider variety of people. So it's the group theory but on steroids in a way, because the group didn't even live in the same place or in the same century. So that's sort of the Miros theory, and again, very interesting. And I don't feel personally competent enough to adjudicate between these various positions. Katonti, I don't feel I have the wherewithal to give any sort of psak halacha among these Geonei Olam, as it were. What I would say, a final figure who I should mention is also Daniel Abrams, a very interesting scholar, and basically he takes it even further, because he believes that his whole position is that the Zohar can't even really be considered a book. In fact, when you say the Sefer Zohar, he'll say, which Zohar? Because we have so many manuscripts. As I mentioned earlier, it was a live text for hundreds of years, and it went over so many editions, and so many, people amended it in so many different ways, and there's so many things that were put in and edited and taken out and added and subtracted, that in fact you can't talk of a stable text, the Zohar, really at all, until the printers decided, okay, we're going to take some positions, some version of it or other, and we're going to run with that as the Zohar. Basically, Daniel Abrams has done tremendous work in that period, how the Zohar went from disparate texts into eventually becoming, a real, it's becoming a book. But his point basically is, you can't even talk about the Zohar, really. What we have is many, a sort of a circle of texts that reflect a bunch of ideas that basically went through so many circles, so many iterations, and so many revisions over the various centuries, that actually we're talking really about a library of texts rather than a stable text in and of its own self. So anyway, these are some of the, just to bring the audience up to date, this is some of what's going on in the academic world currently. And the final thing, I say, sorry about the academic world, which I forgot to mention, is that actually, funnily enough, within the last decade or two, there's been actually a strong shift into the literary components of the Zohar, right? In other words, not the authorship question, and not the question of where the texts come from and what happened to them and where they were, where they were published, etc. But rather taking the Zohar as the text as is, and sort of seeing the literary components and the its manner of storytelling and its narratives and its themes, etc. One person who's published on this is Eitan Fishbane from the JTS, published a great book on the subject. And there are various people who are publishing in this, and this is kind of a little bit of a turn. For those who are knowledgeable in the sort of the world of biblical studies, this is sort of the, not quite the same, but Robert Alter and others who take the literary view of the Bible rather than focusing on the critical textual source of sort of investigations of the Bible. So anyway, this is an overview of what's happened in the last few decades in the academia, and it's a very, very vibrant and interesting and live world of discussion within Jewish studies. And perhaps, I think today, I would say Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism in general is the most interesting, most exciting, most live, most thoroughly discussed and fought over area of Jewish studies bichlal, and has a huge effect on theories of religion, on literature, on the writing of books and novels, etc. So it's really a world that is teeming with life.
So that's the academic field. And the non-academic field, I think it's interesting that this is really not a topic at all. And I'll read in the Hamor edition of the Zohar, again, a really nice edition of the Zohar that came out 26 volumes. At the beginning, they do talk about this. And on page 7, and they bring in the footnote 19 on page Zion, they do bring a lot of the works that we've been discussing, the primary sources. And then they write, we don't see it worth discussing the actual, what we've been discussing here for 5 episodes. Yes. Because it's already been done, established. Meaning everybody is for sure, it's clear. There's no point in having this conversation anymore. And I think that really is the prevailing opinion in the non-academic world. In the non-academic world, as they're saying here in the Hamor, that's the case. In the From world, that's become the standard position that the Zohar is, of course, Hashem Bar Yochai, even though we've discussed, various primary sources throughout here that have this kind of question, and there's a discussion that we've been discussing. But that's become the accepted position, as they say. So I just want to point that out. I mean, I guess it's clear to the listeners. Despite what we've been discussing and what you've been saying, the academic position is in the, I'll just call it the from world, because with the Hasidish, Litvish, Svardish, wherever you go, the position has been and is that the Zohar is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, and
more importantly, they don't discuss it. In other words,
correct. It's not up for discussion, as they just put in that note. Exactly. They bring you. It's interesting in that note of the Hamor edition. They bring you the list of the Sfarim that we've been discussing. That I have this conversation. Well, we're not going to discuss it at all. It's done, finished. So it's important in the academic world. This is a big conversation, and I think this really goes to. It's worth mentioning because this really goes to what we discussed at the beginning, and we did mention at other points, and to mention here as well, which is that the purpose of this series was to do what they didn't do in that note. In that note there, in the note on page 9 in Hamor edition, they say, these are all the primary sources. We're not going to mention any of it. So we said, we're going to mention it. Are we picking a side here at this point of this series? Emphatically, no. It's not the point to pick a side and to say anything. The purpose is just to discuss the history of the Zohar reception and of this really interesting conversation.
100%. And so to wrap up, I think the final thing I'd say is I want to just give it a quick overview. I mean, we now go for 5 episodes, gone through, I'd say, a couple dozen works, a lot of thinkers, a lot of very interesting points. And very briefly, it seems to me there are 6 positions staked out over the history of a rabbinic history, the history of those who've written on the subject, about the Zohar and about the Kabbalah, and just to sort of go Kaseda, right? So from one extreme to the other. So there is the most extreme anti-Kabbalistic position is basically Kabbalah is bad. All of it's bad. The Zohar is obviously late. It's obviously a fraud. It's obviously terrible. However, it is the whole. Not only is the Zohar late, but most importantly, its doctrines are bad. Its doctrines are pernicious, and therefore must be excised completely from the Jewish religion. And that's the position essentially of Bechinat Hadat. That's the position of Shadal, the position of Kapach, and many of the Maskilim, the later Maskilim who we mentioned in the previous episode. Position number 2 is against the antiquity of the Zohar, but seems to rather like it. Okay, and actually seems to see many of the doctrines, or some of the doctrines at least therein, as being positive and actually can lead to great, better learning of Torah, doing on mitzvahs and Yiras Hashem, etc., etc. All the positive things you'd want from a religious person, that can be found in the Zohar, even though the Zohar is late and fraudulent. It's not actually written by Hashem Bar Yochai. That is the position certainly of the Ari Nohem, and I would say that's probably the position of Gershom Shalom as well. A lot of the Zohar he seems to quite like, even if he doesn't believe in its antiquity. And I would say a lot of modern Orthodox Jews who are plugged into the academic world, who know the conclusions of the academic world, etc., and who take them seriously, they would say something along those lines. They say, listen, maybe the Zohar is late, but hey, it's not a bad text. It's an interesting midrash, essentially a late medieval midrash, and there's good things we can learn from it, etc. And therefore, we can have it, so we can accept it, as it were. There's the second position. The third position is what I call the Rav Yaakov Emden position, which is that a small core of the Zohar dates back to ancient period of time, but there are a lot of later additions, emendations, accretions from over the various centuries, and essentially these are, and many of these are not to be tolerated. Many of these reflect all sorts of strange or outlandish or downright heretical even views and opinions, and they kind of got caught up in the Zohar and eventually got printed alongside it, with it. And that is the position of Rav Yaakov Emden. This also seems to be endorsed by the Chasam Sofer, by the Noda B'Yehuda, by some of the later Rabbanim as well. And that's sort of the third position that sees there is some core, some genuine element of the Zohar, but actually a very large part of it is later and fraudulent and pernicious. The position D, I would say, is the flip side position, which is that actually the vast majority is true, but you'll find a couple elements here and there which might be a little bit late, right? So that seems to be the position of Moshe Kunitz, of the Shomer Emunim, possibly the Gra, who apparently was very careful to get as many different copies and manuscripts of the Zohar as possible to try and sort of get the best edition and get the right words out, get the correct girsa, etc. And therefore, and that's the position, the sort of much softer version of Yaakov Emden's position, which is that it's almost, it is mostly correct and ancient and holy, etc. But you'll find little bits here and there, and therefore we have to be careful somewhat. Okay, position number 5 is that in fact it is entirely ancient and holy, completely from Rishon Bar Yochai, and this seems to have been the sort of instinctual position of many down the generations, of course, of Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal, Rav Yosef Karo, most Hasidic thinkers, and basically most of I would say, the yeshiva world today, most of the sort of the Haredi world today takes that position. And the final position, I would say, is the Rav Chaim Kanievsky position, is that not only is it all entirely fully ancient and holy, but if you don't believe it, you're a heretic. In other words, to put it at the very center of the Torah Shebaal Peh line, anyone who denies this is beyond the pale and basically shouldn't be considered one of us, as it were. And these are the 6 positions that we've outlined today. And again, as Nachi mentioned, I'm not here to render judgment. I have my opinions. Some of you may have deduced my opinions from the 7 or 8 hours we've been recording these episodes. But nonetheless, there is a legitimate range of opinion here, and for some people this might matter a lot. This might be a very burning issue: who wrote the Zohar and when, and is it authentic and is it ancient, and how, to what extent can we rely on it? And for some people this might not be. For some people this might be entirely peripheral and or maybe just a slight academic curiosity, but not actually does not have serious implications for anything practical in their religious life or worldview, and that's fully respectable too. And so you'll find a variety of reactions to that, but I think that is a fair overview of the 6 positions that we've encountered over the last 720-something years since the Zohar was first published, since Sefer Yochasin, etc., all the way till today. And that is, it's quite an intellectual journey. So I will thank you all for bearing with us, and I can't believe it, we're still here. Nachi, you said you wanted me to say something about book recommendations at the end?
I do, but I just want to mention the same thing, that for me as well, I enjoyed researching this topic and looking into this. I hope the listener can see I did look into this topic a fair bit and went through it and read up on a lot of these primary sources and some of these secondary sources. It's a fascinating topic, and for those interested in learning more, there's a lot to read, and you can read without even, you're not reading actual, a lot of it is you're not even reading actual Kabbalistic text, just reading about a lot of it's a question around it. Of course, a lot of the what we've been talking about, the criticism or comments, gets into the nitty-gritty. You have to go work through the text and some of it, but some not, a lot of it not. You can just look at various comments, even with Bachas, etc. So it's definitely a very interesting thing to read and to hear about it. And I hope that everyone found it interesting and enlightening. The reception history of the Zohar, right? If we've talked about and something, we've mentioned various opinions which have been very interesting and very enlightening to a large amount of listeners, I would imagine. And with that, so I would like to for you.
But before I say that, I do want to compliment you, Nachi, because as a podcast host myself, I interview all sorts of people, and to interview people, you need to do your homework. You need to, read their books or understand their basic positions and come up with intelligent questions. And this is a mammoth topic, and we've done, I think, a fair amount of justice to it, although, it would have been better if it was 10 episodes and we could do even more justice to it. But nonetheless, it's been 5 episodes, it's been a lot of hours of recording and really getting into a lot of the details of it. And I must compliment you, because this is something that I've been really reading and researching for a long time, and you've had to come a long way in a short period of time and really do a lot of research, and you have. So I want to, as a fellow podcast host who knows how much time and effort is required to do sufficient homework for a series of this size, you've done it, and you've done it well. So you can be proud of that.
Thank you for that. And I do want to end off just to go back to something we talked about a few episodes ago, that we didn't have the full quote, we didn't read. And I think it's worth reading the quote here, because I don't want to go back to many things we missed. And of course, we could have gone on and on, but something that's worth mentioning. Because you didn't read the quote, I didn't realize, and we had it after, which is from the Sefer Menuchas, Rabbi Eliezer Lipman Neisatzu, the Talmud of the Chassam Sofer. You mentioned the Chassam Sofer, you mentioned the Tshuva, but I did want to read the quote, just to read the quote inside from the Chassam Sofer. And he's a Talmud of the Chassam Sofer, is actually printed with Haskamas, this book, printed in Pressburg, and he says, "Vakasher befeirush shamati keni pek kodesh admu, goyin Yisrael kodesh, Hashem, Moshe Sofer, that's called Av Bez around the Kal Kodesh Pressburg." Which is Omar b'fnei Rabbi Talmidim. He said in front of many of his Talmidim, "Ilu hayu chelis biyad adam lahamid midrashay Rashbi al Tarasan." Someone would able to, the actual what Rosh Hashanah read. The vara mitoich mashin ischaber alea mechach me'adorish akrav lehoyu loyeh kula yirak sefer katan hakamas ma'oid machsich dafim mu'atim. The whole sefer Zohar will be a few pages. And so this is something, JJ, I know you said, why am I saying
the Rav Yaakov Emden position, essentially.
Yes, essentially. But this is a Talmud of the Chasam Sofer for saying this, and just I'm reading it. It's from a Sefer Mei Menuchas. You can find this in Hebrew books. You can find the Sefer. And this comment is on page, just if anyone's interested in finding it. Oh, I don't have exactly what page now, but it's in there. And the reason why I bring this up, why am I bringing this up at the end? Because we first of all, forgot to read it inside. I think reading things inside.
That's a sufficient reason, yes.
Also, because what I was saying earlier, that we're not taking a position here, and I want to make that clear. But undoubtedly, there are those that are probably listening to this going, wonder, why bring up this topic? It's clear today, established. We have it. It's clear. But clearly, there were Gedolim printed in Sfarim. This is printed in Sfarim. Such comments, whatever this means. I don't know. I'm not somebody that's really worthy of rendering an opinion on this. Really, I mean that seriously. I am not worthy of rendering an opinion on this subject at all. But it's a fascinating historical conversation with opinions all over the place from Gedolim. I just read this is what from the Chasam Sofer. We met Yaakov Emden, we said in Edividu, we said Abelazar Flex, etc., etc. So of course, and you mentioned the opinion of Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Rav Chaim Kanievsky, the Gadol Hador, was a few years ago. So you have all over opinions, and the academic opinions as well. Of course, I think that was clear probably to everyone before we started this podcast what the academic opinions were. So I do think it's a interesting conversation worth having and worth knowing about. And of course, if anyone argues and that doesn't agree with that, then they're welcome to do that. They don't have to agree with that. And with that, JJ, I want to turn to you, and I want you to reading materials. So
reading materials. My favorite topic, especially for a Sfarim Chatter podcast.
And for the listeners, this is something that I went through myself, as I said, in preparing for this, and this was a lot of work to prepare. I spent the summer preparing for this series, even though you did the bulk of the talking, and great job, and thank you for joining me. Is that I want to give out the reading material for the listeners, primary sources that the listeners can turn to. Actually, no, I take it back. Let's start with secondary sources. I think that's the place to start because I think that's a little easier to get an overview. And if someone wants, they can go to the primary sources, and then there's academic sources. And again, I think let's start there. Go ahead.
Okay, so secondary sources, there's actually only a few that I'm aware of on the topic, and that's why it's easy to get through. So the first is the introduction of Shaya Tishbi's Mishnat HaZohar, which in English was published by Litzman Library as Wisdom of the Zohar. And there he has a very long, 120 page introduction, which includes maybe 20 or 30 pages on this topic, on the history of Zohar reception / criticism / counter criticism, etc. That is an important and useful resource. Another one is a chapter by Boaz Huss in his book Zohar Reception and Impact, which is again, there's a whole chapter on Zohar criticism. Worthwhile, even though both Tishby and Huss miss some of the things that we said today. It's well researched, but it's not encyclopedic. It's not completely comprehensive. Another secondary source important is the article by Mark Shapiro that I mentioned a number of times, and it's titled, and I actually looked it up this time, Ha'im yesh chiyuv laha'amin shezohar nichtav al yedei Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from Melech Shapiro, that's very much worth it. And also, finally, the introduction to my new book on my new translation of Shadal's Vikuach HaChochmat HaKabbalah. So there, I also outline a fair amount of the history of the Zohar criticism. It's about a 50-page introduction. I think maybe like 5 to 8 pages of this is dedicated to that. So I would say that is worthwhile. Again, I do hope possibly to turn this into a full-size book one day. But God should give me strength and tenure. So we'll see. We'll see about both of those things. So that's in terms of secondary sources. In terms of primary sources, what would I recommend most of all? So the truth is that depends a little bit on your level of comfort with Hebrew and then with thickly sourced rabbinic Hebrew, because these are quite different. So I would say certainly for those more comfortable in English, I would go straight to my translation of Shadal's Vikuach HaChochmat HaKabbalah. I think that don't want to blow my own trumpet here, but it's a very accessible translation, and also with an enormous amount of footnotes. And in that book, Shadal's Vikuach HaChochmat HaKabbalah goes through a lot of the arguments and the counter arguments, goes back and forth. So if you are primarily an English reader, that is probably the best place to start. Is my translation of that, and also my book Letters on Kabbalah, where I have some of the letters between Shadal ben Amozeg and Rav Kook and Rav Kapach, and that is that's also important. Also, if you're an English reader, then Shalom's chapter in Major Trends on Jewish Mysticism is a very good anti-Kabbalistic work. I would also perhaps say, as a defense of Kabbalah, just to counterbalance it, Avinoam Frankel's introduction to his translation of the Shomer Emunim HaKadmon also has a little bit of this and a little bit of the arguments pro and against it, and mainly, of course, defending the antiquity of the Zohar. He doesn't do a very thorough job on this, but nonetheless, it's there and it's worthwhile looking at. And he has some good footnotes there as well. So I'd recommend. So that's as much the English speaker. If you want the primary sources and more comfortable in the Hebrew, so I would say as follows. Then the Ari Nohem is certainly the OG. As the kids call them these days, of Kabbalah criticism, in the sense that firstly, it's a very readable book, it's a good book, and it's within the space of, a few chapters, 10 to 20 pages, lays out most of the major arguments, historical and ideological, against the Zohar. That, I think, is very worthwhile. You can get it on Hebrew books, you can download it, you can print it, etc. I would say the Shomer Emunim HaKadmon is a pretty good book as well, in the sense that it doesn't directly deal with this, but it's not bad. The Mitpachat Sfarim. Now, the Mitpachat Sfarim is, you can't miss it out. It is the keystone of this whole series in a way. The problem is that the version that's mostly available to people online and in print is the censored version. That's the censored version from printed in Lvov, I think, sometime in the 1800s. However, there is a much better version, the uncensored version, published in 1995 in Israel in Hebrew. It's difficult to get hold of. If you can get hold of it and go through it yourself, Tavo alecha bracha. That is, I think, the best way to do it. The most thorough source-based arguments against or pointing out, later elements of the Zohar. But again, difficult to get hold of, and maybe, hopefully, we can find and put it online at some point. We'll do that. I mentioned Reb David Luria as a pretty good, reasonable response, and I think of the various responses written, his is, response to Ari Nohem, his is quite good, accessible and worthy of reading. And yeah, I guess Shadal's Vikoch Chokhmat Kabbalah, if you can do it in Hebrew, it's just marvelous. And if you want Ben Mozeg's Tam Lashad as well, but I just think qualitatively it's quite inferior. But yes, I would say definitely Ari Nohem, definitely Shomer Emunim, the good edition of Mpachat if you can find it, and Shadal's books. Worthwhile.
Okay, well, with that, it's been a marathon, wow. JJ. So
it's been I can't believe we're still talking to each other. This is great.
Thank you for joining me.
Each other's company.
And thank you for joining me. And I hope the listeners enjoyed and they stuck it out. I don't know whoever's still listening to this, unless you skipped and fast forward to the end. Hopefully, listeners enjoyed this. And,
I would say to the listeners, feel free to email me your reactions. And I will, in turn, feel free to read them or ignore them.
So I'll put your email address in the show's notes. What's your email if you want to just say it for the listeners?
So it's my name, J Kimche, Kimche, at g.harvard.edu. But you can Google me, find it online. It's on the department website, and all such things. But yeah, I welcome all feedback. And the Jewish world is small enough that you can probably find my WhatsApp from no less than 2 degrees separation anyway. So yeah. I'd be happy for feedback, but I'd also, I reserve the right to respond in as much or as little detail as I care to.
Yes, anyone can reach out, and obviously, I, welcome feedback as well. You can email me sparmchatter@gmail.com, or you can message me on WhatsApp as well. If you're on the WhatsApp community, feel free to message me with your comments or criticism, what you thought of the series and what you think. And also, anyone who's interested in future miniseries, if you like this, let me know what you think. And with that, I think that's all we have. JJ, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you so much, and until next time.